go
first.
and then I'll go, and then Lachlan. Move it over a step.
Get your feet down. Scooch this way, they can get on this.
We don't have room for the last 2 rows. We're not sitting on that. My brother.
I want to say, what's your profile?
I'm going to use this solid
I want to say,
Wait, I think the other day, or yesterday, my brother paid me $20 to use a polygon. I got $20. It was like a free $20. Me too. Oh, wait. It's so useless. I was surprised about this. It was like, because it was like conversation. It was like speaking. She's like, oh yeah, I understand. I was like, oh, okay. She's like, yeah. I was like, thank you. I don't know.
knocking on the open.
Working on it. Nothing in that. Oh, I'm working on it. Left me Also, you can flip, so you do all of that too. All of it.
she's like, you just do. She's like, I love to make up for the jazz, but I think she still wants me to do the dancer jazz.
Oh yeah, I was in ballet last year. I did more for ballet dance when one of them was actually in ballet. She was in 217. Like, I hated that.
Which is very valid.
Yeah, no, she's great. Yeah. I got it. Oh, that was trying to assist. Is that what you Oh, wow.
Jennifer, your mother is going to scold you.
Sorry. Are you?
Maybe the United States government will shut down. So any non-essential people have been laid off or have to go to work with okay. Such as like air traffic controllers and TSA agents and border security.
Oh yeah, air traffic control. Definitely not.
We don't do anything.
No.
I see some of you remembering to remove your hats. The rest of you, please remove your hats. Thank you. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize that we are meeting on the unceded territory of Nakazi Wuteng, which is very fitting for our ceremony today. I ask you to make sure everything's out of your ears, earbuds are out, your phones are off, any device. Thank you. Please stand for O Canada. Can we have a seat, please? This section of bleachers is very noisy. Have a seat. Just a reminder how it works. When we stand for O Canada, we do quietly, respectfully, have our hands by our side, behind our back, or to ourselves. Some of our great tents here. Please stand for O Canada. So our assembly today is about truth. Truth and reconciliation. But today we're focusing on the truth. The truth of how Canada used to operate. The truth how government policies in education tore about families, tore apart families. And it wasn't that long ago that this happened. So to start with, we're going to have Miss Leon talk about some of those truths for us.
Haven't used one of these before. Zanusi Nakasti, Hotel Hotel, Osaka, is Joanne Leon, Susi Nakasti Hotel, is the city of. Welcome to the traditional land of the Nakasti people. My name is Joanne Leon. I belong to the Nakasti Hotel and also the Frog family. So, to start off, most Indigenous people, or all Indigenous people in the world, have their histories and their stories, all of their way of being from time immemorial. Okay? Their time began sometime, and it has never ended. Okay, here, at Nakoban, Stewart Lake, okay? The Nakatne have inhabited the land since time immemorial. The carrier belonged to an oral, matrilineal, collective society that belongs with the clan system. We have the Frog clan, the Silyu, the Beaver clan, Zamasyu. We have the Caribou clan, Wanwawatan, or Grantan. And we also have the Bear clan, Lokjabu. Most carrier call themselves Daka, meaning people who travel around by boat. Their governance, history, culture, language, traditions, multi-generational parenting, and spirituality were all intact prior to contact, prior to colonization. Historically, the Dakas, they belong to the Athabascan language group. We are semi-nomadic, or were semi-nomadic, and we're governed by the 4 seasons. Times of harvest, feast, and rest all took time at specific times of the year. Winter was spent in the pit house with the sharing of knowledge, resources, and parenting, all in the oral tradition. For the purpose of this timeline, the word Indian is used to describe First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people of Indigenous to this country we call Canada. So I'm just going to present to you today a historical timeline. These are facts that have been for Canada, for BC, and for the local people. And we have a lot of memories prior to the 1700s, but those I think are hard. So I'm going to start with, in 1745, there was a battle between the Chilcotin and the Carrier people. It was called Chadlack, and it was a battle in retaliation back and forth between the people, between the communities. In 1755, Chief Quah, or Quay, is born into the Beaver clan, Zamasyu. He will become a prominent historical figure in the Nakata culture and the local area. On October 7, 1763, King George III issued a royal proclamation establishing a new administration structure for the recently acquired territories in North America. He also established new rules and protocols for future relations with the First Nations people. The proclamation has two parts of significance. First, the proclamation defined the land west of the established colonies as Indian territories, where First Nations peoples should not be interfered with or disturbed by settlers, or where the Indian Department would be the primary liaison between the Crown and the First Nations people. Second, it prohibited colonial governors from making any grants or taking any land concessions from First Nations people by establishing a set of protocols and procedures for the purchase of First Nations land. Okay? The acquisition of First Nations land could only be done with the Crown, which is what we call government. Since its issuance in 1763, the Royal Proclamation has served as a basis for the treaty-making process throughout Canada. The proclamation and the accompanying promises made at Fort Niagara in 1764 laid the foundation for the constitutional recognition and protection of First Nations rights in Canada. The fur trade started in the east during the 1600s and moved west until the mid-1800s. This had a huge impact on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis way of life, and because it encouraged strong and healthy men and women to leave their home territories to engage in the new wage economy. When these people left their communities, they took their knowledge and manpower needed for harvesting and maintaining the collective societies they belonged to. In 1805, Simon Fraser ascends the Peace River and eventually calls the central area the New Caledonia. In 1806, Chief Way receives the explorer Simon Fraser with a carrier brought him to Taoche village. Simon Fraser signs his name on the rock face at Maclellan, Sturt Lake. After the arrival of Simon Fraser and assistants John Stewart and James McDougall in 1806, Macaslie became known as an essential location for the Hudson's Bay Company fur trade post, historically known as Sturt Lake Post. In 1821, the Hudson's Bay Company later merges with the Northwest Company, and the post is renamed Fort St. James. 1828, White investigates an incident involving fur trappers and the carrier. As a result, White negotiates with a young fur trader named James Douglas and spares his life during the conflict. Douglas will later become the first governor of BC. In 1831, an Indian residential school for the Mohawk Nation opens in Brantford, Ontario. In 1840, Chief White dies. Known as the Dreamer of the Salmon, the warrior and nobleman chose his burial place at the mouth of Nacapo, Sturt River, where he presides over the salmon weirs that fed his people. Many carrier proudly call White their ancestor. According to oral tradition, White had 5 wives who came from Macaslie, Stalaco, Saikas, and Guzche. He is known for his acquisition of an iron dagger prior to the arrival of the first Europeans in the area, presumably one that was traded from the coast. In 1867, Canada is formed with 4 provinces: Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. In 1872,
Why the outlet isn't off the flash?
the Dominions Land Act was created, and it was designed, the Canadian federal law designed it to encourage settlement of Western Canada through a homesteading system offering 160 acres, free homesteads to settlers who would live on and improve the land. The act also established a survey system and regulated land use, but it also led to the dispossession of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people from their traditional lands. When the settlers were assigned plots of land, the strict borders cut the indigenous people off from the natural borders that defined their territories. The new settlers did not recognize these boundaries. In 1871, British Columbia enters into Confederation. The provincial government of British Columbia believed that indigenous people did not possess a legitimate claim or aboriginal title to their lands. Mainland BC had almost no treaties signed before 1871. In 1876, the Indian Act is enacted, giving the government the exclusive right to create legislation regarding Indians and Indian lands. The Act identifies who is an Indian and establishes related legal rights. The term status Indian refers to an indigenous person who is registered under the Indian Act. While a treaty Indian is a specific type of status Indian belonging to a First Nations that signs a treaty with the Crown. Unceded means a territory belonging to indigenous peoples not ceded or given up to a colonizing group or government. Macasli is considered unceded. Canada is considered the guardian of all unceded indigenous communities because they are without treaties. In 1879, the population for all of Stewart Lake is estimated at 94. In 1883, Sir John A. Macdonald authorizes the creation of residential schools in the Canadian West. Sir Hector Zagabin, Secretary of State for the province, tells Parliament, in order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people will think this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, this is what we must do. In 1885, there was an amendment to the Indian Act that traditional ceremonies such as potlatches and Sundance were prohibited or banned. In 1887, John A. Macdonald says, the great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with the other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change. In 1890, the Indian agent was assigned here to this region. In 1892, Macasli becomes an Indian reserve on September 30th, when the Indian Reserve Commissioner Pete O'Reilly allotted 7 reserves for the Macasli Indian land around Macalpa and Stewart Lake in British Columbia. These reserves were approved by the province on April 14, 1893. In 1907, the medical inspector for Indian Affairs, Dr. B.H. Grace, reports that the health conditions in residential schools are a national crime. The Carrier people of Babine, Fraser, and Stewart Lakes were stewards of the land and water since time immemorial. The people were skilled at building and using their fish piers. The traps allowed for a balanced harvest and live release of fish not harvested to continue on with their life cycle. Then, in 1904, the BC Department of Fisheries began the commercial fishery and closed the use of weirs barricades that would interfere with the fishery. The barricade treaty was created and signed by Slatin, Saikas, Nagazli, Kachi, and Gidche. Chief Joseph of Nagazli signed the agreement in 1911. The government offered fishing nets, a school, and farm equipment, but never fulfilled the agreement. Due to the closure and destruction of the fish piers, the people of Babine, Stewart, and Fraser Lake became poverty-stricken until they transitioned into the use of gill nets. In 1918, the Spanish flu epidemic killed about 70 carrier of Nacobun. Whole families were lost, and many died on their trap lines, and search parties were sent to find them. The 1980 Spanish flu epidemic, I'm pretty sure it was a global epidemic. It wasn't just here in BC, it was everywhere. In 1920, Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, makes residential school attendance compulsory for children between the ages of 7 and 15. In 1922, the Jack Residential School opened in what is now called Fort Fraser, British Columbia. It will serve as the school for the surrounding area. The children were separated into boy and girl dormitories, forbidden to speak their language, had their hair cut and debused, and had all personal possessions confiscated. Before 1925, First Nations had traditional family-based systems for land and resource use, including trapping, and were not regulated by the provincial government. Most trap lines were passed down through the hereditary system. In 1925, the government implemented a mandatory registration. The provincial government passed an order in council establishing a compulsory trapline registration system, requiring the registration of all trap lines to a specific geographical bounded territory. The First Nations people also risked losing their territories if they did not occupy their trap line before the first week of October. Now, First Nations people are exempt from needing a trapline license or a registered trapline for food, social, and ceremonial purposes on their traditional territories. However, a license and a registered trapline is required if you are going to sell fur. In 1931, Chief Louis Billy was the last chief to reign through the traditional hereditary chiefdom. Since then, the Dakat people have engaged in democratic elections. In 1951, major revisions to the Indian Act were made and women were allowed to participate in band democracy. Prohibitions on traditional Aboriginal practices and ceremonies are removed. Tache, or Glasgow Nation, did not become a reserve at a specific point, but rather was amalgamated with other communities in the Sturt-Tonga Lakes Band in 1959 by the federal government for reserved land dispute resolution. The band later changed its name to Glasgow Nation in 1987, and a portion of the group, the Yekooche First Nations, later separated in 1994. In 1951, historically, Indian agents use their broader administrative powers to address child welfare matters on reserve. In 1951, the government introduced new legislation to empower social workers and the provincial and territorial governments with the same authority. Between the early 1960s and the mid-1980s, children were removed from their homes. There were large-scale removal or scooping of Indigenous children from their homes, their communities, and families. This was called the 60s scoop. Their subsequent adoption into predominantly non-Indigenous middle-class families across the United States and Canada are where these children ended up. What was significant about the 60s scoop was that the families weren't informed. The government did not have a legal obligation to tell the families their children were being removed or adopted out. This experience left many adoptees with a loss of sense of cultural identity. The physical and emotional separation from their birth families continue to affect adult adoptees and Indigenous communities to this day. After 1984, the government started to tell the Indigenous families where their children were being placed. In 1961, there was an amendment to the Indian Act that status Indians can vote without giving up their status. In 1969, the government wrote a white paper. Just to clarify, a white paper is a term used by the government when a document that proposes new legislation and the supporting information is evaluated before it can be formally introduced. So in 1969, a white paper was introduced and presented by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and Minister of Indian Affairs Jean Chrétien. It proposed to eliminate the legal status of the Indigenous peoples, repealing the Indian Act, and ending treaties to integrate Indigenous peoples into Canadian society as equals, free from special legal recognition. It failed. In 1973, there was a court case called the Calder Aboriginal title is a legal right that exists in Canadian law based on Indigenous peoples' histories, historical occupation, possession, and use of their traditional lands. The decision was highly significant as it established the Aboriginal title, that it established Aboriginal title as valid and existing under Canadian law. In 1976, the Jack Residential School closes its doors forever. 7,850 students, or should I say children, from 70 nations attended the school from 1922 to 1976. So in 1982, the Canadian government came up with the Canadian Constitution Act, and there are several clauses in there that pertain to the Indigenous people of Canada. So Section 25 serves as an interpretive clause within the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that protects existing Aboriginal, treaty, and other rights of Indigenous people in Canada from being abrogated or derogated by the Charter's other rights. It ensures that Charter rights do not undermine or diminish the rights and freedoms of Indigenous peoples, including those from the Royal Proclamation of 1763 or arising from land claim agreements. Also in the Canadian Constitution Act of 1982 is Section 35. Section 35 recognizes and affirms that existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people of Canada. Affirms the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. These rights are collective rights that are protected under the Constitution, which specific applications vary depending on the treaty or traditional practice involved. The section does not define Aboriginal rights, but provides a constitutional basis for rights such as the right to hunt and fish, the right to land, and the right to the enforcement of treaties. Prior to Bill C-31, First Nations women who married non-status men lost their status. Individuals who wanted to attend university and become a doctor or a lawyer lost their status. War veterans and their families lost their status. Or you could voluntarily enfranchise yourself, and that means you could just denounce your First Nation status. Enfranchisement is a legal process for terminating a person's Indian status and conferring full Canadian citizenship Enfranchisement was a key feature of the Canadian federal government's assimilation policies regarding Aboriginal peoples. In 1985, the government came up with Bill C-31, which amended the Canadian Indian Act to align with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, particularly Section 15, Guarantee of Equality, which primarily addressed gender-based discrimination in Indian status registration. The bill eliminated discriminatory provisions that had previously caused many First Nations women to lose their status if they married non-Indigenous men, while allowing men who married non-Indigenous women retain their status, but also before Bill C-31, a non-Indigenous woman was granted status if she married Kokomo refers to a landmark Supreme Court decision that clarified the concept of Aboriginal title as the right to the land itself, not just its specific uses, and establishes the oral histories are valid evidence in court. The court case was brought by the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs who sought to assert their title and jurisdiction over lands in northwest British Columbia. The ruling emphasized the need for governments to consult with Indigenous peoples regarding their lands. In 2007, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was adopted by the UN General Assembly. This international human rights instrument was developed through the direct participation of Indigenous leaders and advocates from around the world, setting global standards for their rights, well-being, and dignity. In 2011, Binjay became an independent First Nation, Binjay became an independent First Nation in 2019 after a separation process that began with a community vote in 2011 and culminated with the federal government granting independence to Binjay Wet'suwet'en Band. The signing ceremony officially recognizing Manitoba, the University of Manitoba and its partners as a permanent host for the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is established. In 2014, the last Truth and Reconciliation national event was held in Alberta, Edmonton, Alberta. And in 2015, was the closing ceremony of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. From the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 2015, the government came up with 94 calls of action. The 94 calls of actions are statements that recognize and for the future hope to establish the rights of the Indigenous people in BC and Canada. In May 27th, 2021, Kamloops, the Pukwudgie, Kamloops First Nations, shared with the world the tragic finding of unmarked burial sites at the former Kamloops Residential School. Since then, communities across Canada have initiated their own searches and to tell their own truths. In September 2021, UNDRIP principles are incorporated into national laws, such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act in Canada. To ensure the national policies and laws align with these rights and promote reconciliation and a more equitable future for Indigenous peoples. This is our truth. For a quiet moment of reflection
Thank you, Mrs. Leon. I believe the strongest message that Mrs. Leon gave was look at the truth. Before you judge, before you think, find out the history of people, neighbors, your friends, your family.